Okay, so now we've written our first unit test for our Android app. Let's write another unit test, and this time we'll get the opportunity to see how user interaction might work in a Robolectric unit test. I'm going to write another test for my main activity. And this time, what I want to do is I want to test that when the button is pressed, the score increases. So I'm going to say increases score when button pressed. Generally, in my test method names, I'll try to separate the given, or at least the when and the then, in my method names. So in this case, I have my then, what I want to happen, increasing the score when the button is pressed. Now, I'll need to do all of this setup again to get my activity. And so I'm going to copy and paste that for now. I'm also going to need access to the button. And so the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to duplicate this line. And then I'm going to change game score text view to button, which is the ID of my button object. I'm going to name this tap me button. And I'm going to cast it not to a text view, but rather to a button. So I import that with Option Enter. And that's my given. Now I'm going to do my when. I'll do tap me button dot perform click. It's the first option that you see when you look for your options by putting a dot in your test. So now I've tapped the button, and now I'm going to assert that your score has changed to 1. And this will be on the score text. Ooh, text view text. Beautiful. Let's run this test and see how it does. I run that with Control-Shift-R while my cursor is inside of the test body. Great, and when I run all the tests together by moving my cursor outside of the test body but still in the test class and hitting Control-Shift-R, everything should pass together. Good. So this looks good so far. One thing you'll notice is that we have some duplicated code between this and this portions of our tests. Generally, in tests, I don't find myself refactoring that out very much. Although in your implementation code, you may feel the pull to dry things up by removing repetition like this. I don't generally do it in a test. This is the reason. The dry principle, which stands for don't repeat yourself, encourages us to only use our concepts in programming one time rather than repeating them throughout our applications, because then if we need to change something about them, we have to change it in several places rather than in just one place. For example, if the API for Robolectric.build activity were to change, I would now have to change this in 2 places rather than 1. The trade-off with that is that drying things up relies on the assumption that 2 situations are in fact the same. And if those 2 situations are similar, but not exactly the same, then you have to do all kinds of machinations in the code in order to then separate these 2 things that you put together. It is easier to take duplicated code and refactor it into one case of that code than it is to take code that was prematurely dried up into one case and separate it back out into several different cases with the subtle differences that you've discovered on down the road. So I tend to be a little bit slow about drying things up. Also, in tests in particular, my goal is not to be efficient with the lines of code I'm writing. My goal is to be efficient with the information that I am transferring to another developer who may be reading my tests. If somebody walked into my application now and they needed to understand what it was doing, the test file would provide them with some documentation as to what I would like this app to do. And I would like each individual test to tell a complete story about what's supposed to be happening with a particular portion of the application. If somebody sees increases score when button pressed, I want them to be able to very quickly gather the full context, understand what I'm doing in my code, and then understand what I expect the outcome to be of the thing that I am doing in my code. And I will tend to leave that full story in my tests, even if it means repeating pieces of code. Now, does it run more slowly this way than if I were to refactor this into a setup method? The answer is no in this case. And the reason that the answer is no is that this setup method doesn't run before the entire test class. It runs before each individual test, and teardown runs after each individual test. We can run setup and teardown methods before or after an entire test class, but as you can imagine, that gives the opportunity for the state left by one test to affect another test. And that's something we want to think really carefully about before we do it. Now, if we were to refactor this out, this is how I might do it. I might take the controller and the activity, and I might refactor that with Command Option M into its own method. And I'm going to name this method very clearly to indicate what's happening inside of it. So in this case, what does my method do? It gives me my activity. So set up testable activity, I might say. Good. And then I'm going to click OK. Actually, let me take these parens off. Click OK. And now you see a dialog. Process duplicates. Studio has detected one code fragment in this file that can be replaced with the usage of the extracted declaration. Would you like to review and replace it? What it's saying is that it's found this exact same code in one other place in the file. Would I like to replace both instances of these lines of code with my method? I'm going to hit yes. Cool. So now we see that system under test comes from this method called setUpTestableActivity. And then we see we have this private function, setUpTestableActivity, available to us at the bottom.